December 1944. The Ardennes forest stands frozen and silent, its narrow roads packed with snow, wreckage, and the smell of fuel. Beneath low clouds, German Panther tanks idle in concealment. Their crews are veterans. Some have survived Poland, France, Russia. Years of war are etched into their routines, their instincts, their confidence. Across the tree line, American tanks appear. Shermans moving cautiously, crews newly arrived, formations imperfect. To the German gunners watching through optics, it looks familiar, predictable, inexperienced. Another encounter that will end the same way it always has. The first shots confirm their expectations. American tanks burn, crews bail out, radios crackle with kill claims. Laughter follows, quiet, exhausted laughter, but laughter nonetheless. These men have faced the Red Army at Kursk. They have destroyed dozens of enemy vehicles. Compared to that, this feels easy. But then, hours later, more American tanks arrive. And then more the next day. And again, the day after that. Different crews, same markings, same advance. What the German aces are witnessing is not poor training. It is something far more dangerous, and it is only beginning to reveal itself. By the time American tanks met German armor in large numbers, the German Panzer force had already been at war for half a decade. It was not merely experienced, it was hardened by survival. German armored doctrine had been forged in the 1930s around speed, coordination, and decisive maneuver. Blitzkrieg was not a slogan, but a method. Tanks advancing with infantry, artillery, and aircraft in synchronized violence. In Poland and France, it shattered armies that still fought in static lines. The early Panzer crews learned quickly, and those who survived learned permanently. Then came the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 transformed German tank warfare into something brutal and unforgiving. Vast distances, mechanical strain, and an enemy that absorbed losses without collapse created a battlefield where experience became currency. Crews who failed to adapt died. Crews who adapted accumulated hundreds, then thousands of combat hours. Out of this environment emerged the German tank aces. Men like Michael Wittmann, Otto Carius, and Kurt Nispel became legends within the Panzerwaffe. Their reputations were built on confirmed kills, tactical awareness, and an intimate knowledge of their machines. Many served continuously for years. They did not rotate out. They did not reset. War was their profession, uninterrupted. By 1943, German armored units operated as hierarchies of experience. Veterans trained replacements in combat zones. Commanders expected initiative at every level. Tank crews often fought together for years, developing unspoken coordination under fire. This cohesion mattered. In armored warfare, seconds decide survival. But this system came with a cost. Germany's tank crews were irreplaceable precisely because of their experience. Training pipelines were long, fuel shortages limited practice. Replacement crews entered battle with fewer hours and less time to adapt. When veterans were lost, their knowledge vanished with them. The German response was to concentrate skill. Elite heavy tank battalions, equipped with Tigers and later King Tigers, were assigned the best crews. These units became fire brigades, rushed to crises across collapsing fronts. They achieved extraordinary tactical success. Kill ratios often favored them 10-1. Yet every success consumed fuel, ammunition, and men Germany could not easily replace. By 1944, the Panzer force was shrinking, even as its reputation grew. Survivors were more lethal than ever, but fewer. Their worldview reflected this reality. War, to them, was decided by who fought better, who learned faster, who survived longer. Then they encountered the Americans. At first, nothing challenged their assumptions. American tanks appeared numerous but fragile. Crews seemed hesitant. Formations broke under fire. From the perspective of German veterans, this looked like incompetence. They did not yet understand what kind of war the United States was fighting, and that misunderstanding would shape everything that followed. The war the United States entered in December 1941 was not built on battlefield experience. It was built on preparation, production, and scale. Before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army was small, underfunded, and largely untested. Its armored force barely existed. In 1940, American officers studied German Blitzkrieg not as a tradition to imitate, but as a problem to solve. They understood one thing clearly: the United States could not afford a professional, long-service armored elite. It would have to fight differently. American doctrine accepted that losses would happen. What mattered was continuity. Training centers in places like Fort Knox and Camp Hood expanded at unprecedented speed. Tank crews were trained in cycles: basic skills first, repetition second, realism last. Gunnery tables were drilled until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Crews were taught procedures, not heroics. Individual brilliance was secondary to standardization. This philosophy extended to equipment. The M4 Sherman was not designed to duel Tigers. It was designed to be reliable, repairable, and producible. It used standardized parts. It fit on rail cars and landing craft. It could be fixed in the field by mechanics with minimal tools. Its gun was considered sufficient because American planners expected tanks to fight as teams, supported by artillery, aircraft, and logistics. Critically, the U.S. Army separated experience from survival. American crews were rotated, units were replenished. A destroyed tank did not end a formation, it triggered a process. Replacements were already en route. New crews arrived trained to the same manuals, the same drills, the same language of command. They did not need to be veterans, they needed to be interchangeable. This approach baffled German observers. When U.S. armored units first entered combat in North Africa in late 1942, German veterans dismissed them quickly. At Kasserine Pass, American forces faltered badly. Tanks advanced without coordination, command collapsed under pressure. To German officers, it confirmed everything they believed: the Americans lacked the temperament for armored war. But Kasserine also triggered something else. The U.S. Army did not retreat into myth or denial. It rewrote doctrine. Commanders were replaced, training intensified, combined arms coordination improved, and the flow of men and machines never slowed. By the time American tanks landed in Normandy in June 1944, they were part of a system that accepted losses as data. Each destroyed Sherman informed the next engagement. Each fallen crew was replaced by another trained to fight the same way. German tank aces saw only the surface. They saw young faces. They saw procedural movements. They saw mistakes. What they did not see was the machinery behind those mistakes: the factories, depots, training camps, and replacement pools stretching back across the Atlantic. And as the fighting intensified, that unseen system would begin to press against Germany's shrinking margin for error. The battlefield was about to test not skill alone, but endurance. For the American tank crewmen, combat often began without ceremony. Many arrived in Europe with weeks, not years, of preparation behind them. They knew their positions, their commands, their drills. They did not know the enemy. Their first exposure to German armor often came through the crack of a shell or the sudden loss of a neighboring vehicle. Inside a Sherman, space was tight, noise was constant, heat built quickly once the engine ran. The smell of fuel mixed with cordite and sweat. Crews learned fast, or they did not survive. Fear was not abstract, it was immediate and physical. Yet repetition mattered. When contact occurred, procedures took over. Targets were called, ranges estimated, rounds loaded and fired. Even under fire, American crews relied on drilled responses. They were not improvising genius, they were executing training. Losses were heavy. Entire crews were wiped out in seconds. Survivors were reassigned. New men took their place.
The system moved forward regardless of individual fate. For German tank aces, the war was personal history. Many had been fighting since 1941. They knew what a competent enemy looked like. They had faced Soviet T-34s in massed formations. They had endured air superiority, fuel shortages, and mechanical attrition. Compared to that, American armor seemed hesitant. German gunners noted predictable maneuvers. Commanders observed rigid formations. To veterans trained in initiative, this appeared amateurish. The belief spread quickly. American crews were brave, but poorly trained. This belief reinforced itself. Early engagements often favored German tanks tactically. Panthers and Tigers destroyed Shermans at long range. Kill tallies rose. Confidence hardened into contempt. What German crews mistook for weakness was uniformity. American training emphasized identical responses. Crews learned not to outthink the battlefield, but to survive it collectively. Orders were expected to be followed precisely. Initiative existed, but within boundaries. German doctrine prized independent action. American doctrine prized predictability. On the battlefield, this difference looked like inferiority, until it didn't. Because predictability meant replaceability, and replaceability meant persistence. By late 1944, German veterans began noticing something unsettling. The same units they destroyed returned. The same markings reappeared. The crews were different, but the tactics remained. The enemy was not learning slowly. It was learning continuously. And the pressure was only increasing.
On paper, the matchup looked uneven. German Panthers and Tigers carried thicker armor and more powerful guns. At long range, they could destroy a Sherman before it could respond effectively. German optics were superior. Veteran crews knew how to exploit terrain and distance. The Sherman, by contrast, was lighter, more vulnerable, and easier to knock out. German aces understood this immediately. They fought at range, hull down, choosing engagements carefully. In isolation, the German tank was a superior weapon. But the Sherman was not meant to fight alone. It was part of a system. Artillery could be called in within minutes. Fighter bombers loitered overhead. Damaged tanks were recovered, repaired, and returned to action rapidly. A knocked-out Sherman was a loss, but not a strategic one. German tanks were different. A destroyed Panther often meant a permanent loss. Spare parts were scarce. Recovery vehicles were limited. Fuel shortages immobilized even intact machines. American armored warfare moved on rails and schedules. Replacement crews were trained, shipped, and assigned through a system designed to absorb losses without pause. Units rotated personnel, not formations. The division remained intact, even as its human components changed. For German tankers, this was alien. They fought with the same men until death or injury. When a commander fell, the crew felt it deeply. Experience was personal. Its loss was felt immediately. But as casualties mounted, German crews noticed something else. Their victories no longer produced relief. Destroying enemy tanks did not reduce pressure. It intensified it. More Americans arrived. By late 1944, German aces faced a quiet crisis. They were still winning tactical engagements. They were still outperforming individual enemy crews. But the battlefield did not change. Lines did not stabilize. Relief did not come. American formations advanced, regrouped, advanced again. For men trained to believe skill decided war, this was deeply unsettling. Combat fatigue grew. Confidence eroded, not from defeat, but from futility. They were fighting an enemy that did not care how many tanks were lost as long as the advance continued. And soon, in the forests and fields of Western Europe, that realization would collide with reality at full force.
The summer of 1944 should have been the moment of German armored redemption. After the Allied landings in Normandy, German tank units were rushed into a battlefield already shaped by air power and artillery. Roads were cratered, rail lines were severed. Fuel arrived late, or not at all. Yet when German armor engaged American tanks directly, the results often favored the veterans. In the Bocage country, Panthers and Tigers ambushed Shermans from concealed positions. Narrow lanes forced American tanks into predictable routes. German gunners exploited range and angles with practiced precision. Reports spoke of columns halted, companies shattered, and kill counts rising rapidly. From a tactical perspective, the German aces were still masters, but Normandy introduced a new rhythm. Every destroyed Sherman was noted, logged, and replaced. Units that lost half their tanks one day reappeared days later with new crews and fresh vehicles. The Americans did not pause to mourn, they reorganized. German commanders noticed the imbalance first. Panzer units reported increasing enemy numbers despite high kill ratios. Requests for replacements went unanswered. Experienced crews were transferred constantly, exhausting men already near collapse. Heavy tank battalions were committed, withdrawn, and recommitted without rest. The veterans began to feel it. Engagements blurred together, ammunition ran low, engines failed. Crews slept beside their vehicles, waking to air attacks and artillery. Victory no longer brought confidence, only temporary silence. By autumn, the Western Front had become a war of exhaustion. Then came the Ardennes. In December 1944, Germany launched a final offensive, throwing its remaining armored strength into the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. It was a gamble based on surprise, experience, and the belief that American units would break under pressure. At first, it seemed to work. American lines bent, fuel dumps fell, German tanks advanced through snow and fog, veteran crews fighting with the desperation of men who understood this was their last chance. But behind the American front, the machinery was already turning. Replacement crews moved forward, damaged units were reconstituted, the same divisions returned to the line. And for the first time, German tank aces began to realize something was wrong. Their enemy was not running out.
As the Ardennes offensive ground forward, the illusion of decisive victory collapsed, slowly, and then all at once. German armored units advanced deep into American-held territory, but each mile forward stretched supply lines thinner. Fuel became the limiting factor. Panthers were abandoned intact. Tigers stood silent at roadsides, their crews forced to destroy them in retreat on foot. The machines that had once symbolized German dominance became immobile monuments to scarcity. Meanwhile, American resistance stiffened. Tank battalions shattered in the opening days were rebuilt with replacement crews drawn from depots in France and Belgium. These men arrived knowing their odds were poor, but also knowing their procedures. They did not need to match German aces in experience, they needed to hold ground long enough. Air power returned as the weather cleared. Fighter bombers hunted German armor relentlessly. Artillery blanketed road junctions and assembly areas. Every German movement was observed, targeted, and disrupted. For the veteran Panzer crews, exhaustion set in fully. They had been fighting without relief for weeks. Sleep deprivation dulled reaction times. The sharp edge of experience began to fade. Every engagement required perfection because there were no replacements waiting behind them. Then came the realization that ended the laughter. American units kept reappearing. Not improved, not refined, simply present. German gunners destroyed one Sherman, then another, but the next day more arrived. Different crews, same drills, same advance. There was no sense of progress, only repetition. Otto Carius would later reflect that the Americans fought a war of material and manpower, not of individual mastery. Other veterans echoed the sentiment. They had expected their skill to decide the outcome. Instead, they were being worn down by continuity. By January 1945, the offensive had stalled.
German armored losses were catastrophic. Elite units ceased to exist as cohesive forces. The men who had once laughed now fought with a grim understanding. They were no longer facing an army they could defeat tactically. They were facing a system that could not outlast. And as the front collapsed, the consequences became unavoidable. When the fighting in the Ardennes ended, the battlefield told a stark story. German armored units had achieved impressive kill ratios in isolated engagements. Dozens of American tanks lay burned across forests and villages. On paper, the veterans had fought well. In reality, the losses were irreplaceable. Entire heavy tank battalions were reduced to fragments. Crews that had survived years of combat were gone, killed, wounded, or captured. Vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel outnumbered those destroyed by enemy fire. The Panzerwaffe, once the spearhead of German warfare, had been bled dry. The Americans absorbed the blow differently. U.S. armored divisions suffered heavy casualties. Tank crews were lost in large numbers, but formations remained intact. Within weeks, units returned to strength. Replacement crews filled gaps. Equipment flowed forward from depots without interruption. This disparity reshaped the battlefield. German commanders could no longer mount meaningful armored counterattacks. Even when tactical opportunities appeared, there were not enough experienced crews left to exploit them. Surviving veterans were scattered across depleted units, their knowledge diluted. For American forces, the war became one of forward momentum. By early 1945, U.S. tanks advanced across the Rhine, often encountering little armored resistance. When German tanks did appear, they were frequently crewed by hastily trained replacements, lacking the cohesion of earlier years. The irony was clear. The Germans had spent years cultivating elite armored warriors. The Americans had built an armored system that did not depend on elites at all. And the system endured. As the fighting pushed into the heart of Germany, the consequences of that difference became impossible to ignore. In the final months of the war, the imbalance revealed itself fully. German armored resistance, once feared, became sporadic and disjointed. Tanks appeared in isolation or in small groups, often without infantry support, fuel, or air cover. Crews fought bravely, but the cohesion that had once defined Panzer units was gone. Post-war assessments confirmed what battlefield reports had already shown. Germany had lost not only machines, but institutional memory. The death or capture of veteran crews erased years of accumulated combat knowledge. Training programs collapsed under bombing and shortages. New crews entered combat with minimal preparation, facing an enemy that no longer paused or hesitated. American officers reflected differently. After-action reports emphasized procedures, coordination, and sustainability. Success was not measured in kill counts, but in kilometers advanced and bridges secured. The replacement system, often criticized for its impersonality, had allowed units to remain operational despite severe losses. German veterans wrote of frustration. Many described the shock of realizing that their tactical superiority no longer mattered. Destroying enemy tanks did not bring relief, it brought another engagement. The Americans did not need to win each fight, they needed to keep fighting. By May 1945, German armored forces had ceased to exist as a strategic tool. What remained surrendered or was abandoned. The war ended not with a decisive armored battle, but with exhaustion. The laughter that had once accompanied early encounters with American tanks had long since disappeared. What remained was understanding, and that understanding would shape how future wars were planned. The clash between German tank aces and American replacement crews was never truly about tanks. It was about how modern wars are won. Germany entered the conflict believing mastery would prevail, believing that experience, individual skill, and battlefield brilliance could overcome any opponent. For a time, that belief was justified. German armored veterans were among the most capable fighting men of the war. But the United States fought a different war. It built armies that could lose men and machines without losing momentum. It treated combat not as a test of individual excellence, but as a process that could be sustained, repaired, and repeated. Training emphasized consistency. Logistics emphasized continuity. Losses were accepted, absorbed, and replaced. The German tank aces did not lose because they forgot how to fight. They lost because they were irreplaceable. In the end, American crews did not need to be better. They needed to keep coming. That lesson reshaped military thinking long after the last Sherman rolled to a stop. It marked the transition from wars decided by elite warriors to wars decided by systems, industrial, organizational, and human. And in the frozen forests of Europe, amid burned-out tanks and exhausted men, the future of warfare revealed itself quietly. Not in a single battle, but in the simple, relentless fact that when one crew fell, another was already on the way.